Thank you, everyone. Thanks for staying and sticking out to the last session of the day. Today I'll be talking about my dissertation research with bats in Mexico and investigating the potential for bat-friendly agave management for an endangered bat species. So just to give a brief outline, first I'll talk about the bat and agave connection and the implications this has for bat conservation. Then I will talk about my research goals and the integrative approach that I'm taking to answer these goals. And then something I wanted to focus on that's a little different than a traditional academic talk, since this is SICK, is my collaboration with an NGO in Mexico to do and develop my research. And then I'll talk about some lessons that I've learned from doing my internship and working with this NGO and the future direction that I hope my research will take. So everyone probably knows the Miscal worm. That's a pretty ubiquitous image there. Mezcal is similar to tequila. And you may be wondering, what is the connection between mezcal and tequila and bats? Well, mezcal is made from agaves, and agaves are pollinated by bats. And particularly within Mexico, there are three main species that pollinate and feed on agaves. And I'm focusing on the Mexican long-nosed bat, shown here, because of its endangered status, both within Mexico and by the IUCN. And so these bats are long-distance migrators. They migrate every year over 1,000 kilometers between southern and central Mexico, all the way to northern Mexico and the southwest US. And I'm working near Monterrey, Nuevo León, which is in the northeast region of Mexico. And during the migration of these bats, they feed on paniculate agaves as well as columnar cacti. And they feed on the pollen and nectar of these plants. But in the northern portion of the range where I'm focusing my research, they feed exclusively, as far as we know, on agaves. And agaves are also used throughout Mexico for a variety of cultural and economic purposes. So I'm not going to go into all the uses here, but there are a variety of purposes people use agaves for that are very important for the culture. And for these uses, some species are cultivated on farms, as we can see here, and other species are harvested from wild agave populations, both of which have significant implications for bat conservation. And so for several important products, including tequila and mezcal, the flowering stalk, as shown here, is cut off as it begins to grow. And this increases the sugar content of the agave, which is then harvested, but this removes the food source for the bats and may be contributing to their declines. And then this, because the agaves can no longer be cross-pollinated, they then resort to cloning themselves, which in the long run has drastically decreased the genetic diversities of agaves in Mexico, leading to several severe pest and disease outbreaks. And for the harvesting of wild agaves, overharvest has occurred in some areas. And again, this decreases the food supply for the bats and may be contributing to their declines. So there's this idea that actually has been implemented in southern and central Mexico just very recently of using bat-friendly agave management efforts. So this could include something like allowing a small proportion of a farmed agaves to flower and be pollinated by bats, which provide food for the bats as well as hopefully increase the agave genetic diversity over time. Or you could set wild agave harvest regulations or limits that would be beneficial to the bats. And the idea from the people's end is that these bat-friendly products, just like bird-friendly coffee, could potentially be sold at a higher price and therefore contribute to environmentally sustainable development of these Mexican communities. So my research goals are kind of twofold. One is to understand how bat conservation efforts and agave utilization can be linked or could possibly be linked using these bat-friendly methods in northern Mexico, and identify areas and communities in which these bat-friendly programs could be implemented in my study area. So again, I'm working in the states of Coahuila and Nuevo León in northeast Mexico, in the northern portion of the Bats range. And one of the things I'd really like to stress in this talk is my partnership with a local Mexican conservation NGO, Especies, Sociedad y Habitat. And this group has been working with Mexican long-nosed bats, as well as other species in the region, since about 2012. and they've been doing educational outreach work with local Mexican communities, as well as doing some monitoring work of the agaves and the bats. And I recently completed my internship, so I did my internship this past summer with ASHAC. And the idea of doing my internship so early in the program, my first summer, was to implement something that we talk about a lot in ICON. And that is not just working with conservation practitioners to do research, but to work and collaborate to actually develop the research questions. And so that was my hope for this summer, was to collaborate and work to develop my research project. And so as part of my internship, I helped with some of the monitoring of the bats. So we did some mist netting and some cave surveys, which was quite fun for the Mexican Longnosed Bat. And I also helped them learn about, or I also learned about the agaves and the communities in the area, and also collaborated and met with other researchers at the local university as potential collaborators in the future. And so going into this, I had some grand ideas about, okay, well, I will, in order to, for example, identify those agave areas where the bats are foraging and target those areas for conservation, I will, seems pretty straightforward, right? You just find where they're roosting. So this is one of their main roosting caves in my region. It's just south of the city of Monterrey. And the white circle is a 50-kilometer radius circle around that roosting cave, because these bats can fly about 50 kilometers one way every night to forage, we think. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll go down and get some GPS transmitters or radio transmitters, attach them to the bats, and you watch where they go, you monitor them, and you can find where they're foraging by tracking them. Well, by collaborating with ASHAC and talking with the members who have been working with these bats, I found out that it's not so simple. Using GPS transmitters really isn't feasible because these bats are just too small for GPS transmitters to be attached. Radio tracking isn't very feasible in this area because it's such mountainous, rugged terrain that it's hard to navigate. And acoustic detection isn't really feasible either because these bats are such low emitters of their echolocation calls that you can't really pick them up on detectors. And one of the key things that I found was working with this NGO is feasibility issues. You know, I thought this would be a pretty straightforward thing to do, but working in Mexico, this is a small NGO, and money and time issues are very important. And so we have had to be creative in our approach to answering those two questions. So we've come up with this three-pronged integrative approach that addresses both the ecological, these two, and the social aspects of the system. So I don't want to talk too much about this, but the idea is that for the bats, I plan to model bat visitation rates to agaves with the idea of correlating bat visitation to some key environmental variables, and then use those models to identify agave areas that might be critical for these bats or important for these bats, to then target those for conservation efforts. The second thing I'd like to do is estimate the pollination services provided by these bats, and the goal for that is hopefully to find that these bats are providing pollination services to the communities, which would provide support for this bat-friendly management. And then third, the social aspect is to conduct interviews and analysis of the current management of agaves in this area and how bat-friendly methods could potentially be introduced. And so, again, I don't want to focus too much on the methods, but just briefly, for that first part of modeling bat visitations to agaves, I'm planning to use infrared camera setups to monitor feeding at agaves, and then do agave surveys around those agaves, and model bat visitation rate as a function of key variables, such as density of agave plants in an area, density of flowering agaves, distance to the roosting cave, and things like that. And then the second part is quantifying the bat's pollination services. This will involve doing agave exclusion studies and estimating the value of the pollination services provided to the communities. And then finally, for the social aspect, I plan to conduct farmer interviews and focus group discussions, as well as conduct survey questionnaires with these communities to understand how agave management is currently done and what factors may influence people's willingness to adopt these bat-friendly methods. And so one of the key things I'd like to highlight is the lessons that I've learned through working with a conservation NGO for my research. So one of the key things is learning what research is actually needed on this species. You can read the literature, but this really helps by working with somebody who's working on the ground. It helps you understand what actually is needed and how to do it. And that's the feasibility thing, learning what is feasible in the time frame that you have for a PhD and the money and other constraints that are there. And then also, one of the key things that I've been struggling with is the language barrier and my lack of complete fluency in Spanish. And sometimes I question why I'm not working in the US and wish I was. But I really think, although this is a roadblock, or it's an obstacle, but not a roadblock. And I think it is also an opportunity for growth, because I know that by pushing my personal boundaries, I will continue to be able to better work with people from other cultures. And so to wrap up, the last thing this is something I'm really, really excited about that has stemmed from my work and the work of others in this area, is that my work is now part of a working group for the Mexican Longnosed Bat. And so this working group is comprised of ASHAC, so the NGO that I'm working with, as well as Bat Conservation International, other research universities, including both in the United States and Mexico, and government departments like the Fish and Wildlife Service. And this is a binational working group between Mexico and the US. And I'm really excited about this opportunity because this working group will be working towards establishing a range-wide conservation effort for this species. And so my hope is that through my continued collaboration with other researchers, as well as practitioners in the field, that my research, although just a small part of this, will have real-world application to conservation of an endangered bat species. And with that, I'll thank you. And I am keeping a blog, so there's the address if anyone is interested. Thank you very much.